Battling roaring winds and treacherous waves, a lone bush pilot spots a desperate life raft in the middle of a raging storm. With no time to lose, he makes an impossible decision: attempt a landing on an aircraft carrier, defying death itself. The sky was a swirling vortex of gray and black, thick storm clouds swallowing the horizon as rain lashed against the windshield of Captain Jack Lawson's single-engine bush plane. The wind howled like a wild beast, shaking the aircraft as he fought to keep it steady. Flying in the middle of the Pacific Ocean during a storm was never on his list of things to do. But this wasn't an ordinary flight. This was a rescue mission. It had started like any other charter. Jack, a seasoned bush pilot, had been transporting medical supplies to a remote island when he picked up a faint, garbled distress call over the radio. The words barely made it through the static, but one thing was clear. Someone was out there, stranded at sea and running out of time. His pulse pounded in his ears as he banked the plane lower, scanning the violent waves below. The storm made visibility nearly impossible, lightning crackling across the sky in jagged bursts. His hands tightened on the controls as the aircraft jolted from the turbulence. Then, through the sheets of rain, he saw it. A small, battered life raft, barely staying afloat amidst the monstrous waves. His breath caught in his throat. There were people on board, their figures barely visible in the dim light. Some waved desperately, others clung to the edge of the raft, their bodies weak from exhaustion. Jack's mind raced. He had no way to land on the water, and radioing for help would take too long. The storm was getting worse. Every second counted. Just then, his radio crackled again, this time with an unexpected voice. "This is USS Titan, aircraft carrier stationed 20 nautical miles west. We've picked up your signal. Identify yourself." Jack's heart leaped. An aircraft carrier. A chance. But could he reach them in time? Could he land a bush plane on a moving carrier in the middle of a storm? He didn't know, but he had to try. The radio crackled again, the voice from the USS Titan cutting through the static. "Bush pilot, we've got you on our radar. Storm conditions are worsening. You need to turn back." Jack gritted his teeth, eyes fixed on the battered life raft below. Turning back wasn't an option, not when lives were at stake. His fingers clenched around the control yoke as he pressed the radio. "Negative, Titan. I've got visual on survivors. They won't make it through this storm. I need an emergency landing." A pause. Then a sharp, authoritative voice responded, "This is Admiral Harris of the USS Titan. You're flying a civilian bush plane. Landing on an aircraft carrier in this weather is suicide." Jack's jaw tightened. He knew they were right. Bush planes weren't built for aircraft carriers. The deck was too short, the approach too fast, and with the wind howling like a demon, one miscalculation would send him plummeting into the ocean. But he also knew one more thing. If he didn't try, those people in the raft were as good as dead. Jack took a deep breath, his decision made. "I don't have another option, Admiral. I need to land." Silence. Then the Admiral's voice, heavy with resignation. "Understood. You have one shot. I'll have the deck crew ready." Jack pulled the stick, turning his plane toward the Titan's coordinates. The storm raged on, the wind slamming against his wings, but he didn't waver. Every instinct screamed at him that this was madness, but he shut out the fear, focusing only on the task ahead. Minutes later, the massive aircraft carrier came into view, a steel fortress in the middle of the violent sea. Its deck, slick with rain, loomed like an impossible target. Jack exhaled slowly, no second chances. He aligned his plane with the deck, the aircraft shuddering as wind battered against it. The carrier's landing crew stood at the ready, signaling him in. He was coming in too fast. Jack gritted his teeth, cutting power, his heart slamming against his ribs. The deck rushed toward him. The moment his wheels touched the wet surface, he slammed on the brakes, the tires screeching. The plane skidded, hydroplaning across the deck, a deafening silence. Then the plane jolted to a stop just inches from the edge. Jack's breath came in ragged gasps. He did it! But the mission wasn't over. He had to get to that raft before the ocean swallowed it whole. The moment Jack yanked the door open, cold rain lashed his face like icy needles. The deck of the USS Titan swayed under his feet as the storm continued its furious assault. A team of Navy personnel sprinted toward him, their boots slamming against the wet steel. Admiral Harris himself was leading them, his face a mask of disbelief and grudging respect. "Hell of a landing, pilot," the Admiral shouted over the storm. "But your job isn't done." Jack barely nodded, already scanning the churning waves. The life raft was still out there, bobbing violently in the raging ocean, barely staying afloat. "How many survivors?" Jack asked, wiping the rain from his eyes. "3 confirmed," Harris said grimly. "One of them is unresponsive." Jack's chest tightened. There wasn't time to waste. "I need a chopper," he said, "or a rescue boat." The Admiral shook his head. "Waves are too violent. We can't lower a boat without capsizing. And in this wind, even our best pilots won't risk a helicopter." Jack turned back to the ocean, watching the raft disappear and reappear between monstrous waves. The people inside were barely hanging on. If they weren't rescued soon, the sea would claim them. His mind raced. No chopper, no boat. There had to be another way. Then it hit him. "The deck crane," Jack said suddenly, turning back to the Admiral. "You've got a cargo crane on this carrier, right?" Harris blinked, then frowned. "We do, but—" "Lower me down," Jack cut in. "I'll secure the survivors. You winch us back up." A stunned silence. The nearby crew exchanged glances, uncertain. Even Harris seemed to hesitate. "That's insane," the Admiral finally said. "One wrong swing, and you'll be crushed against the hull." Jack's jaw clenched. "And if we don't try, they'll drown." Another pause. Then the Admiral exhaled sharply. "Fine, but if you die, that's on you." Jack didn't waste a second. Within minutes, the massive cargo crane whirred to life, its steel arms swinging out over the raging sea. A thick harness was strapped around Jack's chest, securing him to the crane's steel cable. A deckhand shouted over the wind, "This thing isn't made for rescues. Hold on tight." Jack flashed a tight grin. "Noted." Then the crane operator hit the controls. The ground vanished beneath Jack's feet as he was lifted into the air. Wind howled around him, the rain blinding. Below, the ocean roared, its hungry waves waiting to swallow him whole. As the crane swung him closer, Jack braced himself. The raft was directly below, half submerged, the survivors clinging on for dear life. This was it. He just had to grab them, before the sea took them forever. Jack's boots dangled over the abyss as the crane swung him lower. His grip tightened on the cable, knuckles turning white. Below him, the waves churned violently, their towering crests crashing into the tiny life raft. The survivors were barely visible through the rain. A woman clutched the side of the raft, her face pale and soaked, eyes filled with terror. A young man held onto an unconscious body, an older man, limp and unmoving. Jack's heart pounded. If he didn't act fast, the ocean would pull them under. "Drop me lower," he yelled into his radio, barely hearing his own voice over the wind. The crane whirred, and Jack descended rapidly. As soon as his boots skimmed the surface of the water, he unhooked himself from the harness and plunged in. The freezing water stole his breath instantly. His body locked up, muscles screaming from the shock. But there was no time to adjust. He forced himself to push forward, kicking hard against the relentless waves. The woman saw him first. "Help us!" she screamed, barely above the roar of the storm. Jack reached the raft, gripping its edge. "I've got you. Hang on." He scanned the situation. The young man was trying to keep the unconscious man's head above water, but the waves were relentless. The raft was sinking. "Is he breathing?" Jack shouted, motioning to the older man. The young man shook his head frantically. I don't know." Jack clenched his jaw. No time to check. The priority was getting them all out of here alive. "Listen to me," he commanded, gripping the young man's shoulder. "I'm going to hook you to the harness first. The crane will lift you up to the carrier. Do not let go." The young man hesitated, but nodded quickly. Jack grabbed the harness line, which dangled just above them. Fighting the violent waves, he strapped it around the young man's waist and gave a thumbs up to the crane operator. The line jerked, yanking the young man into the air. The woman watched, panicked. "What about him?" She gestured to the unconscious man. Jack didn't answer. He was already moving. The raft bucked wildly as he maneuvered toward the unconscious man. He was ice cold to the touch. No, damn it. Not now. Jack wrapped an arm around the man's torso and secured the harness around him. "Pull him up," Jack shouted. The crane lifted again, carrying the lifeless body toward the ship. Jack's breath came in ragged gasps. Only one left. The woman trembled violently, barely able to hold on. "Your turn," Jack said, gripping her arm. "I need you to trust me." She nodded, eyes brimming with tears. Jack secured the harness around her and waved at the ship. The crane lifted her swiftly, and she disappeared into the stormy sky. Jack exhaled sharply. Now it was just him and the raging sea. The waves smashed into him, pulling him under. For a moment, all he saw was darkness. His limbs flailed, lungs burning. Not like this. He fought his way to the surface, sucking in a desperate breath. Above, the carrier loomed, the crane hook swinging wildly in the wind. Jack grabbed it with every last ounce of strength he had left. The deck crew shouted as they hauled him up, his body jerking with every pull. Finally, he collapsed onto the steel deck, gasping. Strong hands grabbed him, rolling him over. "You're insane," Admiral Harris muttered, but there was something else in his voice. Respect. Jack coughed, dragging himself up. "Are they okay?" he rasped. The unconscious man was surrounded by medics, one of them performing CPR. The woman sobbed, watching desperately. The young man held her close. Then, a cough. The older man jerked, gasping for air. His eyes fluttered open. The woman let out a strangled cry, collapsing against the young man in relief. Jack let out a slow breath. They made it. But this was only the beginning. Jack sat on the cold steel deck, lungs still burning from the brutal rescue. The storm had finally begun to ease, though the wind still howled around the towering aircraft carrier. The survivors were huddled under blankets near the medbay, shaking from exhaustion and shock. The woman clung to the older man, who was still catching his breath after being resuscitated. Jack pushed himself to his feet and staggered toward them. "You all right?" The young man looked up, eyes filled with gratitude. "If it weren't for you, we'd be dead." Jack offered a small nod, but something was gnawing at him. The aircraft carrier crew had been scrambling since they pulled the survivors aboard. Medics checked vitals, officers whispered among themselves, and Admiral Harris had been on the radio, talking in hushed but urgent tones. Jack didn't like it. Something about this rescue wasn't ordinary. The woman's hand trembled as she reached for Jack's arm. "You don't know what you just did," she whispered. "Who you just saved." Jack frowned. "Who are you?" The older man, who had been unconscious just minutes ago, finally spoke, his voice weak but steady. "My name is Richard Langley." He took a deep breath, then exhaled slowly. "CEO of Langley Aerospace." Jack's stomach tightened. He knew that name. Langley Aerospace wasn't just any company. It was one of the most powerful defense contractors in the world. They worked closely with the U.S. government on top-secret military projects. Jack's pulse quickened, and suddenly he understood why the aircraft carrier crew was on high alert. This wasn't just a rescue. It was an international incident. Langley saw the realization dawn on Jack's face. He gave a grim nod. "That storm wasn't the only thing trying to kill us." Jack's jaw clenched. "What do you mean?" The young man, Langley's son, leaned in, lowering his voice. "Our plane didn't just crash because of the storm," he whispered. "We were shot down." Jack felt his breath hitch. "Shot down?" His voice was barely above a whisper. Langley gave a slow nod. "There was no distress signal, no accident. We were targeted." Jack's mind raced. Who would be bold enough to attack a private jet carrying one of the most influential defense contractors in the world? Before he could ask, Admiral Harris appeared at Jack's side, his face grim. "We need to talk. Now." Jack exchanged a glance with the Langley family. He could see the fear in their eyes. This wasn't over. It was just beginning. Jack followed Admiral Harris into the ship's command center, his mind racing. The tension in the room was palpable. Officers whispered into headsets, radar screens flickered with incoming data, and a digital map showed the exact spot where Jack had pulled the survivors from the ocean. Admiral Harris turned to face him, his expression grim. Langley's plane wasn't just caught in a storm, he said in a low voice. It was intercepted, deliberately taken down. Jack's stomach clenched. By who? The Admiral exhaled slowly, his eyes dark with worry. Satellite feeds picked up an unidentified aircraft in the area right before the crash. No military insignia, no transponder signals. A ghost. Jack ran a hand through his damp hair. So, we're talking about an attack? An assassination attempt? The Admiral nodded. And now we have a very big problem. Jack looked over at the Langley family, still shaken but listening intently. Richard Langley's son clenched his fists. They wanted us dead. Why? The older man closed his eyes briefly, then looked up, his expression hardened. Because of what I know. Jack tensed. Langley leaned forward. My company has been working on a defense system that could shift the balance of power. Something that could detect and neutralize any stealth aircraft in the world. He paused. Whoever tried to kill us doesn't want that technology to exist. Jack exhaled sharply. That explained everything. Before he could speak, an officer rushed up to Admiral Harris and handed him a report. Harris scanned it, his jaw tightening. He turned to Jack and Langley. We've got a match. The unidentified aircraft that attacked your plane. It's linked to a private military contractor, one that's been selling classified tech on the black market. Langley's face darkened. That means there's a traitor. Someone inside my company. Jack clenched his fists. Then we need to find out who it is. Langley met his gaze. And stop them before they try again. Admiral Harris nodded. We're rerouting to a secure military base. You'll be protected until we figure this out. Jack exhaled, looking at the survivors he had just saved. This mission wasn't over. It was just beginning. And now, the real fight was about to begin.